Okay, so I'm an elder millennial slash exennial. I obviously have to do a Jane Austen ranking video. So I've been into Jane Austen off and on throughout the last over 20 years. My first introduction to Jane Austen was the 1995 BBC production of Pride and Prejudice, which my mother was obsessed with. In 1996, 1997, both my mother and I struggled with a pretty lengthy bout of insomnia, and this series was basically our saving grace. Neither of us could sleep, so we would watch that all the time, because also it's 5 to 6 hours long, so you didn't really have that issue of I'm still not asleep, the movie's over and I'm still not asleep, because it was very rare for that to actually end before I fell asleep. At that time, I also saw the Sense and Sensibility that came out in the late 90s, the Emma that came out with Gwyneth Paltrow, and the Persuasion with Ciarán Hinds. That's another 90s movies. So those were the four basically that were on rotation. I had my next resurgence with Jane Austen obsession when PBS did 2 months of Jane Austen this has to be 2006-ish, because I remember where I was working. But I had never seen Mansfield Park or Northanger Abbey or read either of those before, so that was the first time I actually got to see those films and then think about whether or not I was going to read those books, which I did much later. I'm only going to be ranking her 6 main novels. She has a few unfinished works. Lady Susan, The Watsons, and Sanditon. I read Sanditon, and it's the first 70 pages of a first draft that basically sets up a setting and doesn't really talk that much about any of the characters. So while I really enjoy watching Sanditon, I don't really recommend reading Sanditon because it's pretty boring and obviously unedited, and it doesn't really feel like Jane Austen's because she didn't actually finish it. Here is when I read all of these books. I read Sense and Sensibility first in 1998. And then I read Emma in either 1998 or 1999. I'm not 100% certain when. I read Pride and Prejudice twice. I read it in 1999, and then I read it again in 2017, pretty recently. I read Mansfield Park in 2013. I read Persuasion for the first time in 2021, which is odd that I waited that long to read Persuasion. And then I read Northanger Abbey. I started it in 2021, but I technically finished it in January of 2022. So obviously there's a wide berth of when I actually read these. I mean, we're talking about over 20 years. So I have a pretty good memory of how I liked the books. Also because I very frequently watch the movies. I never really forget what the books are about and what they made me feel when I read them. Instead of going in order of my rankings, least favorite to most favorite, I'm going to go in the order that Jane Austen wrote them, and then I will put my rankings on the side here for all of you. So the first written was Sense and Sensibility, and she wrote it in 1797. This has 2 main couples, which I did really like about this story. We have Eleanor Dashwood and Edward Ferrars, and then you also have Marianne Dashwood, who ends up being in sort of a love triangle with Colonel Brandon and Willoughby. I think part of the reason Sense and Sensibility works so well is you have the juxtaposition of the 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne, who have such different views on life, love, what marriage should look like, what life should look like. And I think if you took away either of the sisters, the story wouldn't work as well. I don't know if I'd really enjoy a book that was only about Eleanor or even a book that was only about Marianne, though I do really love Marianne as a character. She's one of my favorite Austen characters. This book has such a pastoral and spring vibe. You definitely feel if you don't like the fake poor, you're not going to like this book, because it's, this family that was extremely wealthy, but they were kind of the man's second family. His first wife had died. He remarried. He had 3 daughters, but he had a son with his first wife. So they get kind of kicked out of their basically palace and have to live with only 2 servants in a really nice house in the country that probably right now costs over $800,000. I really love this book though, and because of that, I put this at number 3 for my rankings. I think the 2 sisters are great. I think Colonel Brandon is one of my favorite heroes. I always like the understated heroes. I saw a great tweet, and I can't remember who tweeted it, that said Sense and Sensibility has all the himbos of the Jane Austen universe, and I totally agree with that. They're all kind of no one is a sharp thinker. They're all sort of head in the clouds, but still really enjoyable. My favorite quote, which I have been to read so I don't mess it up, is, "If I could but know his heart, everything would become easy." Yes, Jane Austen, that is correct. I'm sorry if you can hear children in the background. My kids are home today. They have a lot of random days off this spring. Jane Austen's next written book is Northanger Abbey, and she wrote it over the course of 2 years, 1798 to 1799. This one is Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney are a couple, and then the Thorpes play a very big part in it. We have Isabel Thorpe, and then, what's his name? Mr. Thorpe. I can't remember Thorpe's first name, but he's Isabel's brother. And we have this young heroine, Catherine Morland, who sort of deposited into Bath, and what society is like, which she has been relatively unfamiliar with so far. This is like super gothic and really sarcastic when you're reading it. It's very much like making fun of high society, which was fun. I love the beginning of this book when we start with the making fun of society, but then in the middle it dragged a little bit for me because I felt like it was sort of the same thing over and over again. We have like Isabel being a bad friend, Catherine being so wide-eyed, she doesn't know what's going on. But then I really liked the end of the book. I think it's fun. Henry Tilney is a lot of people's favorite hero, and he is kind of fun. I mean, he's sort of, like a little bit silly, but he works really well with Catherine, which is nice. I do rank this one as 5th place. So it's definitely not one of my favorites. Not to say I didn't enjoy it, but I just don't love it as much as some of the other titles. I would say this is like a solid 4-star read for me though, so still very good. Just not, a lot of these books are like 4.5 to 5 stars. And my favorite quote from Northanger Abbey is, let me put my glasses on. "There is nothing I would not do for those who are really my friends. I have no notion of loving people by halves. It is not my nature," which is a fantastic quote by a terrible character. Okay, next up we have Pride and Prejudice, which was written, so this is a long one. Jane Austen started this in the 1790s, and I think she called it like Love and Friendship. She had a different title, but then she rewrote it in 1812, and I feel like people are always kind of down on the fact that everybody loves Pride and Prejudice so much, but Jane Austen worked on this novel for so long. I think she would love that people love it so much because it obviously took the most of her time out of any of her books. I am a firm believer that Pride and Prejudice has one of the best cast of characters of all time. So we have Elizabeth Bennet. She's a fantastic heroine. We have Jane Bennet, who's also a fantastic heroine. We have Mary Bennet, who's a hilarious younger sister. Kitty Bennet, who kind of gets lost in the shuffle. Lydia, fantastic character. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, hilarious. And the way they play off each other is wonderful. And then you have Darcy, who a lot of people think is the best Austen hero. I don't, but I still think he's very good. Bingley, who is lovely, wonderful, always smiling. His 2 awful sisters. Then we also have like Wickham and Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The cast of these characters in this novel is out of this world. You could tell me any of those characters is your favorite character in literature, and I'd be like, that tracks. So it's really, really fantastic how Jane Austen was able to weave together this story with such great characters. This is my number 1. It seems so basic to love Pride and Prejudice the most because so many people do. And honestly, for a while, I said Persuasion was my favorite just based off the film versions. But after reading both of them, I do think Pride and Prejudice is a better written novel. And Jane Austen obviously wrote one of the best opening lines of all time with this book, which I'm going to read so I don't mess it up at all. But it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. The fact that there's been so many retellings also just tells you that this is such an above and beyond great book. 5 stars, my number 1, Pride and Prejudice. All right, let's switch gears because the next book Jane Austen wrote was Mansfield Park. So, like most people, I don't really like this book. I read this book in 2013 when I was pregnant with my first child. I got it on my Kindle, and it was so hard to get through. I could not read this book. I remember sitting in the hospital. I was not actually in labor, but I had like a false labor, and I was alone. My husband wasn't there, and I was trying to read this because I was like, oh, it'll help pass the time. Oh my God. I don't like this book at all. So we have Fanny Price, who is our heroine. And I feel like Fanny Price, which we'll talk about this when I talk about Persuasion, is like not as good of an Anne Elliot. She's a quiet heroine, which that's fine. Anne Elliot's a great quiet heroine. A lot of the heroines in Jane Austen's novels aren't quiet heroines. But she feels like such an observer. Also, I think part of the reason I don't like this book very much is Mary Crawford, who's basically the villain, seems like a more interesting heroine. I feel like you could have really easily, she's got like more of an Emma vibe going on, but I feel like you could have written a better book with Mary Crawford as the heroine than Fanny Price, who's just sort of like a piece of white toast. I also feel like the story is just very slow. I don't know this one that well because honestly, it's my least favorite film adaptation. So I've only ever watched it maybe 2 times and I have no interest whatsoever in rereading this book. I had to Google a great quote from Mansfield Park because I didn't know one. And this one actually is a pretty good quote, but it feels like it could be in any book. Life seems but a quick succession of busy nothings. Pretty good. I would give Mansfield Park 2 stars, and it is obviously my 6th place book. Next up, we have Emma, which was written in 1814 and 1815. And honestly, sometimes depending on my mood, Emma goes higher because I do really like Emma. Emma Woodhouse is an unlikable heroine, but in her unlikability, she's very likable. She feels like such a real person to me, and I really like the transformation of her character throughout the book. I actually watched the 2020 Emma with my 4-year-old a couple days ago because I usually like to watch that one in the spring, or I have the last couple springs. And when the part where Emma is rude to Miss Bates comes on, we had to pause the movie and talk about why Emma was so rude to Miss Bates and why she hurt her feelings. And I really like that portion of the book because she's so fallible at that moment. There's not a lot of stuff like Elizabeth Bennet's, shortcomings are because people have lied to her. But Emma's shortcomings were actually like a character flaw that she had to go get over, which I really enjoy. I also think like wide-eyed Harriet Smith is such a nice compliment to Emma, who thinks she knows everything about the world. Mr. Knightley's a great hero. He's not my favorite, but I really like him. And Emma's dad is fantastic. For a little while when I was younger, I probably would have ranked this lower because I didn't really enjoy Emma's character growth as much as I do now. When I was a teen, I probably would have put it closer to the bottom, but now I really do like Emma as a character. I would give Emma 4.5 stars. It's ranked 4th for me, but honestly, it could definitely switch places with Sense and Sensibility depending on my mood of the day. And I don't even have to read my favorite quote from Emma because it's so beautiful. How could I forget it? It is, "If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more." All right, so last up is Persuasion, which you obviously know is my 2nd favorite. And for a while was my 1st favorite, and this is why. Anne Elliot is my favorite heroine. She is such a quiet strength, and how she just sort of lives among all these loud, brash people and just keeps trucking kind of and keeps going even though she feels like these people have influenced her to make poor decisions in her life. She moves along. Captain Wentworth is my favorite hero because I love a man that pines for a decade after a woman who turned him down. It's just like, that's like my catnip. The only reason this isn't number 1, considering it has my favorite hero and my favorite heroine, is that I don't think the plot or the supporting characters are as good as Pride and Prejudice is. I still think Persuasion is a very interesting story. I think it has a lot of beautiful lines, and I love the characterization of the main 2 characters, but I do think Pride and Prejudice has a stronger overall plot and overall supporting cast of characters. I will say that Mary Elliot is an absolute gem because she is so funny, and I had seen the film version many, many, many times before I read the book, since I just read the book last year. And I could just like hear the actress that plays Mary Elliot in the film version's voice with all her complaining. Why does no one think I'm a good walker? And like my mom and I say that to each other all the time when we're like, "Are you sure you want to walk? It's kind of far. Why does no one think I'm a good walker?" We say that a lot in my house. And the best line from Persuasion is, of course, "I am half agony, half hope," which is such a well-written line. And it is in a letter in Persuasion, which is even better. So there is my ranking of Jane Austen's 6 novels. We have Pride and Prejudice, Persuasion, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Northanger Abbey, Mansfield Park. They're all lovely, minus Mansfield Park, which I really don't like. But what is your favorite? Or even if you want, give me your countdown in the comments. I love reading other people's rankings. I always think it's fun when you meet people who have wildly different rankings. I've never met anyone who loves Mansfield Park, but my best friend did meet someone who said Fanny Price was the best Jane Austen heroine, and she was like, are you joking me? And then I think they ended up not being friends. If you are a Jane Austen fan, please let me know in the comments. And please, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, give it a subscribe, and I hope you check out some more of my videos. See you soon.